Mason had lost everything to save a life no one else seemed to care about. He could have walked away, but something inside him wouldn't let him. One cold, stormy night, Edith, an elderly woman with her dog, knocked on his door. She wasn't asking for much, just a warm place to stay for the night.
Shouldn't be here.
Mason didn't have to open that door, but something in her quiet strength made him hesitate. Before we see what he decides, I'd love for you to subscribe and turn on the bell for more stories like this. And if you don't mind sharing, where are you watching from today? Mason Hale had made his peace with solitude. He lived in a small cabin perched on the edge of a mountain, far from the world below. Every morning, he woke up to the quiet, the cold air that filled his lungs, and the silence that surrounded him. It was a life of simplicity, a routine he had come to cherish.
Something's out there.
He had been here for years, away from the world, hiding from the memories he couldn't bear to face. But tonight, everything was different. The storm outside grew stronger, the wind howling as snow whipped against the window. Mason sat by the fire, lost in his thoughts, when a soft knock on the door interrupted his peace. He hadn't seen anyone in months. Who could be out there, in the middle of the storm? At first, he thought he had imagined it, but the knock came again, louder this time. Mason stood up slowly, his joints stiff from age, and crossed the room to the door. His instincts told him to ignore it, to let the storm rage outside. He had lived this way for so long, with no one else, and had come to prefer it. But something about this knock felt different. He opened the door, and the cold rushed in, biting at his skin. Standing on the porch was an elderly woman, bundled in layers to protect herself from the storm. Her silver hair was tucked under a scarf, and her face was worn, but her eyes were clear, strong, and full of quiet resilience. She wasn't asking for charity, just for shelter. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her voice steady despite the cold. "Just one night of warmth. The storm's too much for us to make it through." Mason glanced down at the dog standing beside her. A German shepherd, large and sturdy, with a thick dark coat. The dog stood still, its amber eyes watching Mason, as if waiting for him to decide. For a moment, Mason considered turning them away. He wasn't used to letting anyone into his life. He had learned the hard way that it was easier to stay distant.
Come in, it's
But
cold out
something
here.
inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't had in years. He stepped aside, motioning for them to come in. The woman gave him a grateful nod, and as she stepped across the threshold, the dog followed her, its posture alert and steady. The warmth of the cabin hit them immediately, and Mason closed the door behind them, shutting out the storm. Edith, the woman, moved toward the stove, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled off her gloves. She was older than Mason had expected, but there was a strength in her that reminded him of his mother. The dog, Sable, stood by the door, watching everything, but never leaving Edith's side. Mason didn't speak at first. He wasn't sure what to say. The silence between them felt heavy, but it was the kind of silence that didn't feel lonely. It felt like something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you," Edith said after a while, her voice soft but warm. "I'm Edith, and this is Sable." She nodded to the dog, who looked at Mason with an intensity that made him pause. "Mason," he said, his voice quiet. He cleared his throat and moved toward the fire. "What brings you up here in the storm?"
Rest easy.
"We've been traveling," Edith replied, her eyes distant for a moment.
Anything out there?
"Sable and I, we've been trying to get by.
Rest
The world's
easy.
too much sometimes. We just needed a safe place for tonight." Mason nodded, unsure of what to say. He wasn't used to talking to anyone, especially not about things that weighed on him. But there was something about Edith's calm presence that made him feel like he didn't need to explain. The room grew warmer, and Mason realized that the quiet wasn't as lonely as it had been before. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like something was being shared, even if unspoken. Mason couldn't help but notice the way Sable kept his watchful eyes on him, never leaving Edith's side, but always aware of everything around him. The dog's calm demeanor reminded Mason of something he had forgotten, the need to protect, to care for someone else. "Thank you," Edith said again, her voice warm with gratitude. "I'm just grateful for the warmth. We'll be out of your way in the morning." Mason didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't used to people staying in his space, in his world. But something about Edith, something about Sable, made him feel like he wasn't alone anymore. As the night went on, Mason sat in his chair by the fire, watching the flames dance. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her dog and how they had changed the quiet of his cabin. For the first time in years, he wasn't just living in the past. There was something different in the air, a shift, a choice that he couldn't ignore. As the night went on, Mason sat in his chair by the fire, watching the flames dance. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman and her dog and how they had changed the quiet of his cabin. For the first time in years, he wasn't just living in the past. There was something different in the air, a shift, a choice that he couldn't ignore. The storm cleared by morning, but Mason's mind was still unsettled. Edith had shared little about her life, yet Mason could feel the weight of her story. Could one night of shelter truly change his life? Or had he just opened a door to something more, something he wasn't ready for? Mason awoke to the sound of the wind still howling outside, the storm now reduced to a steady flurry of snow. The cabin felt warmer, quieter now that Edith and Sable had settled in. He didn't expect to sleep so soundly, but there was something about having company again, something that softened the silence. The fire still smoldered in the hearth, and the faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. As Mason rose from his bed, he pulled on his boots and walked toward the stove. The cabin felt different now, filled with a new presence, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel as empty. The quiet wasn't quite the same, it wasn't the peace he had known before. He found himself listening more carefully now, paying attention to things he hadn't in a long while. The sound of Edith's soft cough from the other room, the way Sable moved across the floor with the quiet purpose of a guard dog. It all made him uneasy, but also curious. He made coffee and set about preparing breakfast. He wasn't sure what to do next, but the weight of having Edith and Sable there made him uneasy in a way he hadn't expected. He was used to being alone, and the idea of opening up to someone again, of letting someone into his life, was still foreign to him. When Edith emerged from the other room, she looked a little better. The warmth had done her good. Sable followed her closely, the dog still as vigilant as ever, keeping an eye on everything around him. Edith sat down at the small table by the window and looked out at the morning light, which was still faint but promising. "Morning," Mason said, setting a steaming mug of coffee in front of her. He glanced at Sable, who was sitting just inside the door, his watchful eyes scanning the room. The dog hadn't relaxed all night. "Morning," Edith replied with a soft smile. She seemed tired, but there was something calm in her expression. She reached for the coffee, her hands still a little shaky. "Thank you," she said again, her voice full of gratitude. "I didn't expect to be here, but it seems like the storm had other plans." Mason nodded. "Storm's a beast this time of year. It's not safe out there." He sat down across from her, taking a sip of his own coffee. There was an awkwardness in the air, the kind of silence that comes when you don't know what to say, but something told him not to rush it. Edith seemed to sense it too, but after a moment she spoke again. "I wasn't sure where else to go. Sable and I, we've been on our own for a while now. We've been moving, trying to stay ahead of the worst of it. But the storm caught up with us." Mason listened carefully, though he didn't press. It wasn't his place to ask too many questions. He had learned the hard way that the more you know, the more you're tied to a person's story, and Mason wasn't sure if he was ready for that. "Where were you headed?" Mason asked, his voice softer now, less guarded. "Just trying to get somewhere safer," Edith replied. "I've got family up north, but it's a long way. I thought we could make it, but the storm—" She trailed off, looking out the window again. "Sometimes things just don't go as planned." Mason took another sip of his coffee. "Things rarely do," he said quietly. Edith's eyes flickered back to him, and there was something in her gaze, something that made Mason feel like she wasn't just talking about the storm anymore. She was talking about the life she had left behind, about the things that had brought her here. "Do you mind if I ask what happened?" Mason asked before he could stop himself. For a moment, Edith didn't answer. She seemed to consider the question, then shook her head slightly as if weighing whether it was worth sharing. "It's a long story," she said, her voice quiet, "and not one I like to tell. But I can say that I've been through more storms than just the weather." Mason didn't press further. It wasn't his place. He understood what it was like to carry things without speaking of them, to let the past fade into the background while you tried to move forward. "I didn't come here to cause you any trouble," Edith added, as if sensing the weight of her words. I just needed a place to rest. Mason nodded, though he still felt a bit uneasy. There was a quiet dignity in her that made him respect her. She wasn't asking for much, just a place to stay until the storm passed, until she could move on. Sable moved toward the door, standing still, his ears pricked. Mason glanced at the dog, who had been quiet all morning, but was now alert, focused on something beyond the cabin. The dog's behavior struck him as odd. He'd never seen a dog so intent on watching the outside world like that. "What is it, boy?" Mason murmured, getting up and walking over to the door. He opened it slowly, stepping outside, and glanced around the yard. The snow was deep, the wind still strong, but there was nothing unusual. He closed the door and turned back to Edith. "You okay?" Mason asked, noticing her worried expression. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, though her eyes lingered on the door, on Sable. "It's just, he's been acting odd lately." Mason didn't say anything, but he watched the dog carefully. Sable wasn't growling or barking. He was just standing still, looking at the door as if waiting for something. Mason couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The dog's behavior, the way Edith seemed to be hiding something. It all left him uneasy. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew one thing. The storm wasn't the only thing he had to worry about. There was more to this visit than a simple request for shelter, and Mason could feel it in the air. By the time the morning passed into afternoon, Mason was more certain than ever that opening his door to Edith and Sable was only the beginning of something. The storm had not only forced them into his cabin, it had brought him face to face with a new reality. He could no longer hide in silence. He could no longer pretend the past didn't matter. The storm had passed, but the air still held a bite to it, the kind that left your bones aching if you stayed too long outside. Mason stood at the window, watching as the last of the snowflakes fell, swirling around the trees in delicate patterns. The mountain was still and quiet again, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't the peace he had come to expect. It felt like the calm before something bigger, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. Edith was still inside, sitting by the fire, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Sable lay by the door, his eyes scanning the cabin, his body still as ever. Mason hadn't spoken much this morning. He had enough to think about without adding more to the mix. The dog's behavior was still strange, alert, focused, like it was waiting for something. And Edith, she wasn't telling him everything. He knew that much. There was a part of her story she hadn't shared, and Mason wasn't sure if she ever would. He had already opened his door to them, though. He had offered shelter, and with that came something he hadn't expected: responsibility. He had known he couldn't stay alone forever, but the weight of it was heavier than he anticipated. Sometimes it felt like opening the door to one person meant opening the door to everything. And now the world outside had pushed itself into his life again, in the form of a woman and her dog. Mason moved away from the window and walked to the stove, where a pot of soup simmered. The small things, the routine, helped ground him. He wasn't sure why he was still doing it, why he hadn't just closed the door and told Edith to find somewhere else to stay. But something kept him here, something he couldn't explain. "You said you've been traveling," Mason said, breaking the silence. Edith looked up, her eyes tired, but her expression softened when she saw him. "Yes," she replied, her voice quiet, the weight of those few words carrying more than Mason had expected. "It's been a long journey, longer than I thought it would be. But sometimes we don't get to decide the road we walk." Mason nodded, though he didn't fully understand. He had walked his own road for so long, he couldn't imagine what it was like to feel like you didn't have control over where you ended up. The road he had walked had been solitary. He hadn't allowed anyone to share it, and yet here he was with Edith and her dog in his cabin, trying to figure out how he had gotten to this point. He placed a bowl of soup in front of Edith and sat down across from her. They ate in silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the soft rhythm of Sable's breathing. Mason watched them both for a moment. Edith, who had come to him in the storm, seeking shelter, and Sable, who had stood guard all night, like he was waiting for something to happen. It wasn't long before Edith spoke again. Her voice was low, but it held a quiet strength that made Mason listen. "I didn't come here to ask for more than what I needed," she said, her eyes meeting his. "But the truth is, I don't know how long I can keep going. The road ahead..." She trailed off. the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Mason didn't reply at first. He couldn't. He knew that feeling, the feeling of carrying something so heavy, you weren't sure you could take another step without it breaking you. It was a feeling he had lived with for years, the kind of weight that never quite let go. And now, Edith was asking him to carry part of it. "I can't stay here forever," Edith continued, her voice quiet but firm. "And I'm not asking you to fix anything. I just need time. Time to figure out what comes next." Mason felt something shift in him. He had been avoiding attachment, avoiding involvement, because he knew the cost. He had lost enough in his life to understand that people, whether they were family, friends, or even strangers, came with a price. They asked for things. They needed things. And when you gave, you risked losing something precious. But as he looked at Edith, sitting across from him, her face weary and tired but steady, he realized something. Sometimes the cost was worth it. The choice was clear. Mason stood up and walked to the window again. The snow had stopped, but there was a heaviness in the air now. He wasn't sure if it was the storm that had passed or something else, the weight of the choice he had made. "I'll help you," Mason said, his voice steady, though there was a tightness in his chest that hadn't been there before. "I can't promise you answers, but I can promise that for as long as you're here, you'll be safe. No one's going to hurt you." Edith's eyes softened, a glimmer of gratitude in them. She didn't say anything right away, but her silence spoke volumes. Sable rose from his spot by the door, his eyes fixed on Mason for a moment. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He just stood there, as if acknowledging that Mason had made the right choice. Mason knew it wasn't just about shelter. It was about something more, something deeper. It was about standing up, even when you weren't sure what you were standing for. The storm had passed, but something had shifted in the cabin, in Mason himself. The quiet he had long sought was gone, replaced with the weight of responsibility. And as the day stretched into evening, Mason realized that helping Edith and Sable wasn't just about offering shelter. It was about facing the choices he had avoided for so long, the choices that defined who he was and who he would become. As night fell, Mason sat by the fire, his mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. The road wasn't always clear. Sometimes it was winding, full of obstacles and choices that weren't easy. But for the first time in a long while, Mason knew that he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The cabin had settled into a quiet routine over the past few days. The storm had cleared, but the cold still clung to the mountain. Edith had grown stronger, though her cough still lingered, and Sable, always vigilant, hadn't relaxed. It wasn't just the weather that had them on edge. Something about this place, this town, felt like it was waiting for them to make the wrong move. Mason could feel it. He'd spent years isolating himself from the world, keeping his distance. But every step he took in helping Edith and Sable brought him closer to a past he had spent so long running from. And now, that past was catching up. Mason was out chopping wood when he heard the truck approaching. The crunch of tires on snow and gravel cut through the stillness, a sound that made him pause. He wiped his brow and turned, wiping his hand on his pant leg. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, the kind of noise that promised company he wasn't sure he was ready for. The truck pulled into the driveway, its headlights cutting through the quiet. He knew who it was before they even stepped out. Deputy Connor Wren, the man he had spoken to briefly at the pharmacy, stepped out of the vehicle, followed by a man Mason had never seen before. A tall man, solidly built, dressed in a dark jacket with an authoritative air about him. Mason stood his ground, but there was a tension in his chest, a knot that wouldn't ease. "Afternoon, Mason," Connor called, his voice friendly enough, but there was something guarded in it. "We need to talk." Mason nodded slowly, his hand resting on the axe handle. He had a feeling this wasn't just a casual visit. The way Connor had said, "we need to talk," made it clear this was about more than just weather or town gossip. The man who had accompanied Connor was standing back, his hands in his pockets, observing the cabin and the surroundings with an air of familiarity. The kind of man who came from money or power, someone who knew how to intimidate without saying a word. "What can I do for you?" Mason asked, his voice steady, but the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Connor glanced at the other man, then back to Mason. "We've been looking into some of the properties around here, and, well, your place came up." His words were carefully chosen, measured. "There's a situation we need to clear up." Mason didn't respond immediately. He had a feeling he knew what this was about. Edith, the foreclosure notice, North Star lending. He could almost feel the heaviness of it settling into his bones. He had already promised Edith that she would be safe here, but promises, Mason knew, didn't always hold up when people with power started knocking. The man stepped forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he sized Mason up. "I'm Silas K," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I'm in charge of overseeing these things in the area." Mason didn't trust him, the way Silas spoke, the way he moved. It was the kind of confidence that came from knowing you held all the cards. And Mason wasn't sure what cards Silas thought he was holding, but Mason knew he wasn't about to give him any more. "I'm afraid we have some questions about your guest," Silas continued, his eyes flicking over to the cabin. "And her dog? Sable, is it?" Mason's jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral. "Edith's not a criminal," he said quietly. "She's here to rest, nothing more." Silas smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't say she was..." "But you understand the importance of keeping things above board, don't you? This isn't just about charity. We've got protocols for people who come through, especially when they're staying for longer than expected." Mason took a slow breath, the tension rising in his chest. He wasn't sure where this was going, but he knew it wasn't good. He could feel Edith's presence inside the cabin, hear the soft sounds of her movements, feel her uncertainty through the walls. "I'm not asking for anything," Mason said, "but she's not leaving. Not today, not anytime soon." The silence between them grew heavy. Silas's smile faltered for a moment, and Mason could see the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "We'll see about that," Silas said, his tone hardening. "But don't get too comfortable, Mason. There's more at play here than you realize." Connor didn't speak, but his eyes darted between Mason and Silas. He looked uncomfortable, but Mason couldn't tell if it was because of the conversation or because of something deeper. Mason stood tall, his eyes fixed on Silas, unwilling to back down. "You've said your piece," he said. "Now, I'll say mine. You can threaten me, you can try to intimidate me, but it won't change anything. Edith stays here until she's ready to leave, and you're not going to scare me into making a different choice." The wind picked up, swirling the snow around them, as if to emphasize the finality of Mason's words. Silas didn't speak again, but the message was clear. He wouldn't give up easily. As the two men turned to leave, Mason watched them go, his heart heavy with the weight of what was coming. There was more at stake than just the cabin now, more than just Edith and Sable's safety. There was something deeper here, something Mason wasn't sure he was ready to face. Mason closed the door behind him, the weight of their visit settling on his shoulders like a stone. The storm had cleared, but the fight was just beginning. And Mason knew, deep down, that there would be no easy way out. As night fell and the cabin grew quiet again, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. He had promised Edith safety, but the walls around him, both inside and outside the cabin, were closing in. And the question that lingered in his mind wasn't if he would stand up to them. It was whether he could protect what mattered most. The night dragged on with the kind of quiet that was never truly peaceful. The wind outside had settled into a relentless gust, cutting through the trees, but inside the cabin there was a different kind of tension. Edith had retreated to her corner, Sable beside her, both of them as alert as ever. Mason had sat by the fire for hours, watching the flames flicker, feeling the weight of the day's events pressing down on him. The visit from Silas and his companion had left him unsettled, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the quiet was broken by the sound of the door creaking open. Mason stood up immediately, his instincts kicking in. He had expected trouble, but this was different. Someone had come to the door, someone who didn't knock. It was Harper Vale, the local reporter who had already shown more interest in Edith's situation than anyone else in town. Mason had spoken to her briefly at the pharmacy, but he hadn't expected her to show up here. She had a determined look on her face, one that suggested she wasn't leaving without getting answers. "You're here earlier than expected," Mason said, his voice low but calm as he stepped into the entryway. Harper nodded, her dark eyes scanning the room before she stepped inside. "Had to get here while there was still some daylight. You've got a lot of people talking, Mason. North Star's been busy and not in a good way. I've been digging through records. They've been taking properties left and right, and your guest, well, she's just one of many. Mason didn't say anything right away. He could feel the weight of her words, but the truth was he had already known. The system was broken, and Edith's situation was just another example of it. The hard part was that, for once, he couldn't stay on the sidelines anymore. "I've got proof," Harper continued, pulling out a small envelope from her bag. "I've been following the pattern, and what I found, it's bigger than just foreclosures. There's something wrong here, Mason, something crooked, and it's tied to North Star. It's more than just bad lending practices. They're pushing people out on purpose." Mason took the envelope from her, opening it carefully. Inside were several pieces of paper, documents, photos, notes from previous cases, all pointing to a deeper issue. It wasn't just about the foreclosures. It was about power and control, and how North Star had managed to take advantage of people like Edith. "This is all I need," Harper said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. "I can take this to the right people, but we'll need to make sure it gets into the right hands. The law might not want to move, but the public, they'll listen. They have to." Mason nodded slowly, the weight of the decision settling in his chest. "And what happens when they come for us? What happens when North Star decides we're too much of a problem?" Harper's eyes met his, unflinching. "Then we fight. We don't let them silence us. We don't back down." Mason felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something else. Something that had been dormant inside him for years. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet that had once been his refuge no longer felt like safety. It felt like a trap. The fire crackled in the hearth, and for a long moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against the cabin, trying to force its way inside. Finally, Mason spoke. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "I'll help you, but we need to be careful. This isn't just about Edith. It's about everyone who's been pushed around by North Star. We take this to the people, but we don't do it recklessly. We don't give them an excuse to make us disappear." Harper gave him a nod of approval, and for the first time, Mason felt the faintest glimmer of something resembling resolve. There was a lot to lose, but there was even more to gain, and they wouldn't fight this battle alone. Later that night, Mason sat by the fire again, the paperwork in his hands now feeling more like a weapon than a burden. Outside, the world seemed to be holding its breath, but inside the cabin, things were changing. He couldn't undo what had already been done, but he could stop it from happening again. That was the first step, and for once, he wasn't sure how this would all play out. But he wasn't running anymore. He was going to stand his ground. As the flames in the hearth flickered low, Mason looked across the room at Edith, who sat quietly by the fire, Sable resting beside her. She didn't ask for any of this, but she had found herself at the center of something bigger than any of them. And Mason realized that whatever came next, he couldn't walk away. The fight wasn't just about justice for Edith, it was about fighting for what was right. The night passed slowly, and when morning came, it brought with it a new urgency. Mason had made his choice, and there was no turning back, but the real battle was about to begin. North Star wouldn't just roll over, and Mason knew deep down that this wasn't just about saving Edith's home. It was about saving the people who had been silenced for far too long. The sun rose slowly the next morning, casting a soft glow over the mountain. The snow had finally stopped falling, but the weight of the previous days lingered in the cold, crisp air. Mason stood at the window, staring out at the silent, frozen landscape. He hadn't slept much, his mind too full of the choices ahead, the fight that was coming. But there was something else now, something that had shifted quietly in him. He wasn't just doing this for Edith, he was doing it for himself too. For the first time in years, Mason wasn't sure how this would end, but he knew he had to stand. Edith and Sable were still asleep, the dog resting by the hearth, his body curled in the warmth of the fire. Mason's eyes lingered on the dog for a moment. Sable had been a constant, unwavering presence since they had arrived. The dog didn't ask questions. He simply stood guard, ready to protect those he cared for. And Mason realized, with a quiet weight in his chest, that he had allowed himself to become like Sable, standing at the door, guarding against a world he didn't want to face, but now had no choice but to confront. Edith woke soon after, slowly stretching out of her chair by the fire. The lines of fatigue were still etched on her face, But there was a new strength in her eyes, a quiet resolve that matched the steel in Mason's chest. She looked at him, then to the window, before speaking. "You're going to fight, aren't you?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. Mason didn't immediately answer. He wasn't sure what the answer was yet, but he had made up his mind the night before. It wasn't just about the fight against North Star. It was about more than that. It was about standing up for what was right, for people like Edith who had been discarded by a system that never cared. He owed it to her, and to the people who had been swept aside, to not back down. "I don't know how this ends, Edith," Mason said quietly, "but I know it's time to stop hiding." Edith nodded, her gaze shifting back to Sable, who was now awake, watching the two of them with his calm, intelligent eyes. She gave the dog a soft pat on the head before standing and walking over to Mason. The movement was slow, deliberate, but there was something in her step that told him she was ready. She wasn't just here for warmth anymore. She was here to fight too. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "I'm not going anywhere. I won't run." Mason's heart tightened. She hadn't said it like a plea or an apology. She had simply said it like a fact, something that was as true as the mountain itself. It wasn't just about the home anymore, or survival. It was about standing up and refusing to be pushed down. The morning passed quietly as the two of them prepared for the day ahead. Mason knew it wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was full of obstacles. North Star wasn't going to let go of their grip easily, and there were people in this town who would be just as eager to see Edith and Sable disappear into the storm. But for once, Mason wasn't thinking about what could go wrong. He was thinking about what could go right. Later that afternoon, they received an unexpected visit, this time from Connor Wren. Mason had expected more visits from Silas or others sent by North Star, but Connor's appearance surprised him. The deputy was alone, his expression tight with something that wasn't just about duty. "Can we talk?" Connor asked as soon as he entered, his tone low, his eyes scanning the room like he was checking for threats. Mason nodded, leading him toward the table where they had shared their quiet mornings. "I heard about your plans," Connor said once they were seated. "I'm not going to lie, Mason, I've got a job to do. But I've seen enough of what's been going on with North Star to know it's wrong. I don't know how far I can help you, but I'm not going to turn a blind eye either." Mason's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't trust easily, especially not with everything that was at stake. But something in Connor's voice rang true. He wasn't here with threats or promises. He was here with a quiet, tentative support that Mason hadn't expected. "Why now?" Mason asked, his voice low, cautious. "Why help now?" Connor shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening as though he was wrestling with something. "Because I know what it's like to turn away, to look the other way when something isn't right. And I'm done doing that. People like Edith, like you, don't deserve to be treated like this." The words hit Mason harder than he expected. He didn't know how to respond at first, his mind still processing the depth of what Connor was offering. "You think you can stop them?" Mason asked, finally. "I don't know," Connor admitted, his eyes steady. "But I know we can't do it alone. I've got people I can talk to, officials, lawyers who've been fighting this kind of thing. It's not going to be fast, and it's not going to be clean. But it's the best shot we've got." Mason sat back, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He hadn't expected Connor to come forward like this. He hadn't expected anyone to stand by him, but now it seemed like the first real chance they had to fight back. "I appreciate it," Mason said quietly. "But it's not just about us. This is bigger. There are a lot of people being hurt by this, and if we don't stop it now, they'll just keep doing it." Connor gave him a short nod. "I know, and we'll do what we can. But this thing, it's going to take time." The two of them sat in silence for a while, the enormity of the task ahead settling over them. As the afternoon wore on, Mason realized that the fight was far from over. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be fast. But with each passing moment, the burden felt a little lighter. They weren't fighting alone anymore. The fire burned low as Mason stood by the window, watching the snow start to fall again. This time, it didn't feel as cold. He didn't know how long the fight would last, or where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, Mason wasn't alone in it, and that made all the difference. The quiet that had settled over the cabin felt like a temporary reprieve from the storm Mason knew was still brewing. Though the sky had cleared and the wind had softened, something had shifted in the air. The fight for Edith's future, for all of their futures, was far from over. Yet, for the first time, Mason felt an odd sense of clarity, like the pieces were falling into place in a way that felt strangely peaceful. Edith had begun to heal. Her cough had subsided, and the weariness that had clouded her eyes had started to lift. Sable, too, had found his rhythm, his watchful gaze softening slightly, though still alert. Mason couldn't help but notice the change in the dynamic of the cabin. It wasn't just a place to survive anymore. It had become a home, a refuge. And the quiet that had once been Mason's constant companion now felt warmer, more alive. He stood at the window, watching the snow-covered mountain. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, the world outside was still, almost serene. But inside the cabin, the calm was filled with purpose. The preparations were underway. Connor had kept his word. He and Harper had gathered the information, the proof they needed. North Star's web of corruption was beginning to unravel, but Mason knew that exposing it would take more than just documents and a quiet rally. This fight was about the people, about those who had been crushed beneath the weight of a broken system. Edith had spoken quietly the night before, as they sat by the fire. "I never thought it would come to this," she had said, her voice tired but strong. "But I'm not going anywhere. This isn't just about me anymore." Mason had nodded, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. He knew that, just as Edith had said, this was about more than just her. This was about standing up to something much bigger than themselves. Something that had been festering in the shadows for too long. Later that evening, when the fire was low and the wind began to pick up again, Mason heard a knock at the door. His first instinct was to brace himself for another confrontation. Silas, or one of North Star's men, maybe. But when he opened the door, he was surprised to find Connor standing on the other side, looking even more somber than usual. "Mason," Connor said, his voice tight. "We've got a situation." Mason stepped aside, allowing Connor to enter. What's happened?" he asked, his heart already racing in his chest. "It's getting worse," Connor replied, his eyes flicking toward the window. "I've got word from Harper. They're making their move. North Star's going to push back harder. They're not going to let this slide." Mason's pulse quickened. He had known this was coming, but the reality of it felt heavier than he had expected. They weren't just going to expose the truth. They were going to have to fight for it. "What do we do?" Mason asked, the weight of the question pressing down on him. He hadn't expected an easy answer, but he knew this was the moment when things would change. "We stand our ground," Connor said, his voice firm. "We expose everything we have, all at once. The town's been quiet too long. We get them to listen, Mason. We get them to see what's really been happening." Mason nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew the cost of this battle. But he also knew there was no turning back now. As the evening wore on, they made their plans. They would meet with Harper the next day, gather the community, and take the fight to North Star. It wasn't just about Edith anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had been wronged by a system that had failed them. By the time the night had fallen completely, Mason was sitting by the fire, the weight of everything ahead sinking into his bones. But as he looked across the room at Edith and Sable, he realized something. They had already won. No matter how this played out, they had found something in each other, something worth fighting for. Mason's mind wandered to the past, his time in the service, the battles he had fought, the ones he had lost. It had always been about survival, about doing what was necessary. But this was different. This was about standing up when you had nothing left to lose, when the fight wasn't just for your own life, but for the lives of others. Sable, sensing the shift in the air, stood from his spot by the fire and moved to Mason's side. He sat down next to him, his presence as steady as ever. It was as if the dog knew, just as Mason did, that the real battle was about to begin. Edith joined them soon after, her hand resting gently on Sable's head. The warmth from the fire, the sense of peace that had settled in the cabin, made Mason feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The world outside was still cold, the storm still on the horizon, but Mason had something now that he had been missing for years: purpose. And with that purpose came a strength he hadn't known he still possessed. Mason knew that tomorrow would be the beginning of something new, There was no going back, no hiding from the fight that awaited them. But as he looked at Edith, at Sable, at the life they had started to build here, he understood that he wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for something that mattered, for people who mattered. The storm had passed, and the sun was finally shining on the mountain. The battle wasn't over, but it no longer felt like a battle he had to face alone.